podcast, which is a place where he's, I would say, in touch with the profane world, so to speak, and pursuing his intellectual interests and keeping abreast of the topics of the day. But then he has his Waking Up enterprise, which is predicated on the meditation app that he designed and has brought to the attention of many people. And he discussed that as an extraordinarily positive element of his existence and a replenishing element. So, Sam, this is the way it looked to me, is that, you inhabited this world of ideas and propositions, and you were part of the new atheist movement as part of that, and an avid participant in public debates. And then you discovered this other domain that's associated with meditation. And I see that as, what would you say? It seems to me, and this is not going to come as any shock to you, is that that's the manner in which the domain of spirituality has been integrated into your life. And first of all, I want to know if you think that's a fair characterization. And if it is a fair characterization, how do you square that with still being explicitly atheistic in your pronouncements?
Yeah, well, so just to be clear, the insights and experiences that led me to become very interested in the contemplative life and in meditation as a specific practice, and in all of the ethical implications of the kinds of first-person insights we can have into the nature of mind by looking closely, either with the aid of psychedelics or the aid of just traditional practices like meditation or solitude or retreat, etc. All of that came before any of my culture war experience, and even before my scientific interests and the intellectual interests that brought me into prominence in the so-called new atheist moment, which was more of just a kind of a publishing phenomenon. A bunch of us had published books more or less in the same period that got attention, and so we were treated as a four-headed atheist. So I started with the spiritual component in my 20s. I mean, really my late teens, and based initially on a couple of experiences I had with psychedelics, but then after a cumulative 2 years or so spent on silent meditation retreats in my 20s and many trips to India and Nepal and studying with various teachers, I did all of that before I went back to school and got a PhD in neuroscience and started studying belief at the level of the brain. And then September 11th happened, and then I had I became more public because I wrote my first book in direct response to what was happening in the culture there. The reason why it was, my atheism is grounded very directly in those experiences and insights that lead me to believe that whatever is true about our spiritual opportunities, these truths are more fundamental than culture. They're certainly more fundamental than any sectarian literature or any accident of birth. The people were just divided by a language barrier or a mountain range. So I felt, even before I saw the negative social costs of religious sectarianism, pre 9/11, I felt that no one had the right, the intellectual right to their religious provincialism anymore, because we just know too much. Christians and Buddhists and Hindus and Muslims have been in dialogue for too long. We know that someone like Thomas Merton, a Christian contemplative of great eloquence, he got so much of his spiritual worldview from his engagement with Buddhism and Taoism, and those traditions seemed indispensable to him in framing his sense of what really our spiritual potential is. And there's so many other examples like that, again, that we can read with real profit still. So I've always been someone who was in principle non-sectarian. I just wanted to take the best ideas from whatever source, wherever I could find them, and recognizing that whatever there is to be discovered about the nature of our minds and beyond, whatever there is to be discovered about our entanglement with reality altogether, can be discovered now and described now in terms appropriate to this century. And so that's so it was what changed for me after 9/11 was the sudden political and societal urgency of making the case that we have to get out of the religion business ultimately, because it's people were taking it too seriously.
Okay. So let me unpack that a little bit. So the case you're making, is it a fair restatement of the case you're making that it was actually your depth of religious experience and belief outside of the sectarian that made you, like, are you atheistic or anti-dogmatist?
Well, that's, for me, those are the same thing. Yeah. I mean, my argument is that atheism has no content. Atheism is just a rejection of religious dogmatism. In the same way that, I think there's a talk of mine online titled "The Problem with Atheism." It's just it is a term that has been exported from religious argumentation, and it's in the most basic sense, it's a word I don't think we need. I mean, we don't need a word for not being an astrologer. Nobody calls himself a non-astrologer. No one goes to a conference for non-astrologers. We can reject astrology because there's no good evidence for it. And if people were using astrology to make decisions of enormous civilizational import, we would view that rightfully as a kind of emergency, right? We'd have to figure out how to discredit them, and to get them out of the offices to which they'd been elected, presumably. But we wouldn't have to define ourselves as non-astrologers. We could just use words like reason and evidence and science and common sense, et cetera. And so I've always been a bit of an anomaly in the atheist community because I felt that organizing around the variable of atheism politically is a kind of dead end. And I likened it to, someone draws the chalk outline of a dead man on the ground and you just walk over and put yourself in it, right? It's like that's because atheism is as a concept something that has terrible PR and terrible associations in society for reasons that have nothing to do with what the real criticism of religion is. I mean, people imagine that atheism is synonymous with a dogmatic rejection of spiritual experience, as though it was all a matter of temporal lobe epilepsy and conscious fraud. And that's not at all. I mean, that need not be true. I mean, yes, you can find the occasional atheist who fits that description, but it certainly wasn't me. I mean, and I've had, sort of a baby in the bathwater argument. I believe I was quite aware of the baby in the bathwater that we don't want to throw out when we throw out organized religion.
Okay. So let me ask you about that. And I'll put forward another proposition. So it seems to me that you're making the case that you had very deep spiritual experiences, even before you got involved with the so-called New Atheist movement, that you've returned to them to a great degree with your emphasis on meditation. But I'm still curious about one aspect. If I said, say, that God is that which was the basis for your spiritual experience, let's say that is a definition. I'm not offering it as a proposition.
Right.
I'm offering it as a definition. What do you think of that? Like, what do you make of a proposition like that?
Well, that sounds like...
Is that unreasonable?
Well, no, but that would be just using God, as some people do, certainly some mystics do, as a synonym for consciousness, or what I'm calling consciousness. So consciousness is the basis, certainly, of any possible experience.
Okay, fine. So let me ask you about that, because I think it seems to me as a consequence of. All right, let me back up a little bit. I've been engaged in the process that you recommended, right? I'm trying to take a look at the wisdom traditions of humanity insofar as I'm capable of comprehending them through as many different lenses as I possibly can. So, for example, and one of the ways I solve the problem of arbitrary interpretation is by assuming that unless I can ground my interpretation in three or more different sources of simultaneous interpretation, I'm going to regard them as spurious. So, for example, I could say the reason that it seems to me that voluntary confrontation with tragedy and malevolence is redemptive is because that's what you see in the clinical literature. It's the predicate of learning theory, and it's also exemplified in religious tradition. And that's three independent sources of evidence. And so I think you can do that in many different domains. And I have done that. With regards to the definition of consciousness, like your equation of consciousness with the divine, let's say, and I'm doing my best not to put words in your mouth. I don't really, Sam, I got to tell you, I don't see any difference between that at all and the insistence in the biblical corpus that the essence of God is logos. Because I think the word logos is as close to our modern word. It's actually a better word for what we refer to as consciousness in the modern world than consciousness is. Because logos is not just the word, it's also the process of exploration and communication. And that is associated with what's divine in the biblical corpus. It's the thing that gives rise to the world. And so I don't know what you think about that interpretation, if how that jives with your own thinking.
Well, I think it remains to be seen. So my association with logos, I certainly don't consider myself a scholar here, but it seems to suggest to me because of its connotations with language and knowledge, it suggests to some degree an entanglement or reliance upon concepts, right? So like it has structure to it, which all knowledge requires, and certainly all communication requires. But consciousness itself in my view, consciousness itself is prior to and ultimately separable from it, because you can certainly imagine linguistic structure and conceptual knowledge, and even intelligence. To come back to the topic of AI, which we touched in our previous hours briefly. Yeah. I just imagine we build super intelligent AI that seems to be a fount of conceptual knowledge, and it is in fact a fount of conceptual knowledge, even beyond the human. But let's just stipulate that we built it in such a way so that it's not conscious, right? So there's nothing that it's like to be that super intelligent machine, right? It's no more conscious than a toaster. I don't know if that's possible. I mean, perhaps at a certain level of intelligence, consciousness comes along for the ride, but my sense is that it could be possible. And conversely, there are systems that are very likely conscious that are not capable of much communication, or certainly communication that we find interesting, right? So the so-called lower animals, I have every reason to believe that a mouse is conscious, but as to what it's thinking or what it's communicating, my sense is not a whole hell of a lot.
Well, I would say in the development of the idea of logos historically, I would say that the capacity for attention takes precedence over conceptualization. So although it is the case that there are interpretations of logos that are very much dependent on its association with verbal communication, those aren't allied with the central theme of thought. Mm-hmm. So I can give you just a quick example of that. So Adam in Genesis, who's a manifestation of logos, is an embodied consciousness before he names. right? Naming comes later. And the naming capacity, which is the conceptual and semantic capacity, that's regarded as a derivative of what's more fundamental. And that logos is probably more closely associated with what modern people describe as attention than it is with like semantic categorization. So it's more, and I think it's very difficult to distinguish it from consciousness as such. And I also think, by the way, that you're insistent that consciousness precedes categorization I think that's obvious neurobiologically. And like, I don't think that that's really something that's worthy even of discussion. I mean, of debate. I also think that your comments with regard to AI and the potential for AI to manifest all of the signs of consciousness without any consciousness, I think that's also highly probable. In fact, I think it's probably already happened to some degree, because ChatGPT is already at the point where it more or less passes Turing tests. Like, if you don't know that you're talking to a machine, I mean, you can trap it now and then and figure it out, but you'd never know. Like, if we would have thrown ChatGPT 20 years back in the past and asked people if it passed the Turing test, they'd say yes immediately. But I don't see that there's any indication whatsoever that it's conscious. No. And I think we could easily build simulacrums of consciousness that are basically soulless demons, and then we better look out. Yeah, that's coming along very, very rapidly. So anyways, I do think that the logos concept is very much associated, and the idea that it's the highest divinity is very much similar to your proposition that, it's consciousness somehow that's at the bottom of all things.
Well, I think consciousness.
How do you square that with materialism?
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
I would add here, I think consciousness is, importantly, because it's the basis of all actual and possible experience. Again, however that experience is grounded, it's the basis of any illusory experience. Again, we're asleep and dreaming now, or we're psychotic, or we're being simulated on some alien supercomputer. Even a state of total confusion is just as much an articulation and manifestation of consciousness as any verisimilitude in our perception of the world. So, which is a reality or illusion, reveals the space of consciousness just as fully. But importantly, it's being the basis of all actual and possible experience. It is, in my view, the basis of all actual and possible value. Right? If you're going to say there's nothing that's important, even possibly important, that is outside of consciousness. In principle, right? So if you're going to say, and just imagine what it would take to disagree with this. You just say, I've got something in a box over here that's actually incredibly important, but it has absolutely no actual or possible effect on the conscious experience of anything now or in the future. So by definition, what you have in that box is among the least interesting things in the universe, right? And certainly it's something that no conscious mind, actual or potential, could value. So the moment you ground value in consciousness, then consciousness itself subsumes all of our spiritual and even religious preoccupation. So you take the beliefs of a fundamentalist Christian, say, or a conservative Muslim, both of whom are quite worried about spending eternity in hell for wrongly believing the variety of things, but in particular about the identity of God. Well, what would be wrong with going to hell for eternity? Well, it would only be wrong because it's a circumstance of tremendous suffering, for eternity. That, if anything's bad, that is bad. But the cash value of its badness is again in consciousness, right? If consciousness is the problem, the fact that there will be something that it's like to be in hell, if hell exists, that's the problem with hell, right? So consciousness is everything, and it is the only thing that we as conscious beings are directly in contact with moment to moment. Everything else we feel like we're in contact with, whether it's other people or the reality of our own body or our position in the world, the truths of mathematics, anything is mediated by this primal circumstance that there's something that is like to be us. The lights are on where you stand,
right? And somebody's home.
The universe is illuminated where you sit, and that's even if we come to understand that ultimately scientifically, that is still a miracle. I mean, that is akin to the miracle that there's something rather than nothing in this universe.
Yeah, right. So, Sam, how do you? I'm going to take as granted the things that you just laid out for the sake of this question. You talked about that box, and there's something in it that could have no potential effect on consciousness. How do you conceptualize existence before the dawn of consciousness, evolutionarily speaking? Because I've walked down the same conceptual path that you just laid out, it seems to me, and I think Descartes did too, because I don't think Descartes meant I think, therefore I am. I don't think is the right translation. It's more, it should have been translated something in a manner that's something more akin to logos. But anyways, before, I presume, as an evolutionarily oriented biologist, you presume that consciousness itself emerged at some point in the evolutionary history of animal life. God only knows when that was. But how do you conceptualize the existence of everything that there was prior to the dawn of consciousness?
Well, again, there I'm pretty agnostic. I actually don't know how far down consciousness goes, right? So I wouldn't be surprised either way. I mean, and this is why it's such a hard problem. I mean, this is why it's been called the hard problem of consciousness by philosophers of mind, starting with David Chalmers, who gave us that phrase. It's just the whatever story you tell yourself about unconscious complexity, whatever the requisites of the emergence of consciousness actually are, it's always going to seem like a miracle. It's always going to seem like you could ask the further question, but why should there be something that it's like to be that, right? Let's just say that it requires, 10,000 units of information processing in, eukaryotic cells conforming to some structure. But if you lose one of those units or the structure is slightly different, well then, that system is not conscious. There's nothing that it's like to be that system of neurons or any other processing units. Well, okay, if that's the answer at the back of the book of nature, that would be interesting, but it's still the mere statement of a miracle. It's not, our intuitions don't run through so that we get some explanatory value out of that answer, right? Which is not what happens in the rest of science. Basically, everything else in science, with a few exceptions in quantum mechanics, where we don't pretend to understand what the realistic picture of the universe actually is. Elsewhere in science, no matter how complicated things get, our intuitions, the microstructure of the world, actually explains the character of the phenomenon at the more macro structure above, right? So the reduction runs through and has some explanatory value. I mean, the simplest case is take something like the wetness of water, right? Well, the wetness of water at the gross level, the level of your hand sweeping through water, is precisely what you would expect if at the micro level you have molecules of water freely sliding past each other at that temperature. So you have liquid water, right? So, and why does water get frozen? Why does it get hard when it's frozen? Okay, well, the lattice structure of that phase change in water, that explains what we see at the macro level. The answer to what consciousness is and how it relates to information processing or anything else that in the physical quote unconscious world, it still seems to me always, even if it's true, it's going to be the kind of thing that is not actually an explanation. We're going to receive it as some kind of brute fact, which we just have to shrug our shoulders over. But it's also possible that consciousness runs deeper than that, and that something like panpsychism is true. I mean, maybe consciousness doesn't emerge at any level of complexity. Maybe consciousness is a fundamental feature of the universe at every level of scale. And it's not that electrons are thinking thoughts like human thoughts, but that maybe there is some interior dimension of what we would recognize to be a proto-subjectivity even to an electron. I wouldn't expect the universe to appear any differently if that were true. I wouldn't expect tables and chairs to start talking to us. But if everything is humming with some interiority, all the way down, that would still leave open some very difficult questions of how conscious minds as we experience them emerge, and why is it that we seem, as a matter of our moment-to-moment conscious awareness, not to be identical to everything that's happening in our brains, for instance. And it seems like there are things happening in each of our brains right now which we are functionally unconscious. At least the we that are
right. Most things likely,
but at least the we that are having this conversation. It opens even the split brain research does this. It opens the possibility that there are kind of unintegrated islands of consciousness even within a normal intact brain, right? Because insofar as information sharing across regions of cortex is never going to be perfect, it's possible to have kind of parcellated points of view that are essentially equivalent, however, even in a transitory way, to the split brain phenomenon, where we know that there really are two conscious points of view introduced by severing the corpus callosum. So there are lots of mysteries here, but it's just a very long way of my saying I don't know. I'm not confident that I can say where consciousness emerges or that it emerges, and it could be that it's quite a bit more mysterious than information processing in mammalian brains.
How do you conceptualize your focus? This is the last question I'll ask you, I think. How do you conceptualize the relationship between your assumption of the primacy of consciousness and your investigations in the meditative realm? How do those come together?
Well, the latter is a direct experience of the former. I mean, so for me, meditation is just recognizing what consciousness is like prior to thought. Now, it's not necessarily in the absence of thought, because you can recognize thoughts themselves as appearances in consciousness, and that's what that is what it is to meditate while also thinking. But many people think meditation is it's understandable because it's often taught this way. Many people think that it is a technique that is being added to your experience. You're doing something extra when you're meditating. I mean, you have your normal waking life. You're seeing, you're hearing, you're smelling, you're tasting, you're touching, you're thinking, you're feeling various emotions, and if you're like most people, you find that you often don't feel very good doing all that, and you wonder how you could be happier, and you have some sense that someone knows something about how to become happier, and then meditation gets recommended to you as a tool by which you could begin to intrude upon your own tendencies and sort of the automaticities of your subjectivity. And so this is something you're adding to your life for the purpose of having certain insights and actually ultimately hopefully feeling better moment to moment. And so that's how you receive it. And now you're given this technique. And if it's, let's say, ordinary mindfulness, the technique might be, well, in the beginning, pay attention to your breath and just notice how hard that is. Notice that you get distracted by thought. And then the moment you notice you're thinking, you just come back to the breath, and you begin to build that muscle of just directing attention to an object. It can be, the breath really is an arbitrary object, but being arbitrary, it works like every other object. But it could be sounds, it could be sensations elsewhere in the body, it could be a visualization, it could be just what you see with your open eyes, it could be anything you notice. The crucial practice is to notice when you get lost in thought, and then to come back to paying attention clearly to something in your experience. But as you deepen the practice and you actually understand its logic better, you recognize that meditation isn't actually something you're doing or something that you're adding to experience. It's something you're ceasing to do. It's something that you're doing less rather than more. And the thing you're ceasing to do is you're ceasing to be distracted by thought. This next thought that arises that feels like yourself, that feels like I. That's the thing that at a certain point you get perspective on that. You recognize that consciousness, often called awareness, in it's kind of a term of jargon in these in any teachings about meditation, but I use them synonymously. That which that which is in you that is aware of your experience is prior to the arising of this next thought and this next mood and this next reaction and this next intention. And the more you drop back into that just kind of mirror-like quality of just being aware, two things happen. One is you cease to suffer in all the ways you were tending to suffer because they were predicated on your being taken in by the next thought, being lost in the dream of self-talk that is telling you why you should be disappointed or anxious or fearful or whatever. So it's not that your self-talk has changed necessarily, although one can change, as you know, you can change your self-talk, and can be a good thing to do. But your perspective on thought itself has changed. And thoughts, the moment you notice that, an angry thought just arise and pass away without any implication, without you having gotten on the ride and become angry on its basis, that becomes, it really is a kind of revelation. At that point, you can recognize, okay, well, you can decide whether or not it's worth being angry. You can decide the moment you find yourself getting angry because you've been caught by something, that can become a kind of mindfulness alarm, and you can recognize, okay, is it worth being angry? And if the answer is no, which 9 times out of 10 the answer is no, you can actually just then drop back into this position of just being mere awareness and notice the physiology of anger dissipate, and it has a very short half-life. And you can notice the thoughts that are trying to convince you why you have every right to be angry. You can notice them just arise and pass away, and you can feel that your mind natively, your consciousness is just this open space in which everything is arising all by itself. And the crucial insight, the insight that sounds spooky to many people, but it is really the insight that is at the center of the bullseye of this conception of spiritual life, is that the sense of self, the sense of I, the sense that there's an ego in the center of experience, that is a kind of illusion born of identification with thought. And it's one that I'm convinced that people are constantly losing without recognizing that they're losing it. I feel that our sense of self, our sense of egocentricity, our sense of subject-object perception is continually collapsing in ordinary people who don't know how to meditate, but they don't have the metacognition to recognize what that collapse feels like and the implications of that collapse. So there are moments where your attention gets diverted and you're just, you might say you're lost in your work at that moment. Like you're concentrating so much on something, the time is flying by, and you don't have this sense of looking over your own shoulder as the subject of your experience, appropriating experience from outside of experience. You actually have this period of time where you're just identical to experience. But again, it's unrecognized. And meditation is the only mode wherein we consciously recognize being identical to experience, no longer being on the edge of it or seeming to be on the edge of it. We're no longer being in the center of it. We're not riding on the horse of consciousness. We're actually identical to it. We're not witnessing the stream of consciousness from the being on the riverbank. We are simply identical to the stream. And that difference, that loss of subject-object perception it's not only intellectually interesting, and I think neurologically more plausible, it's actually liberating of the kinds of psychological suffering that we are desperate to get rid of by every other means. And so that's why it's kind of the salvific, or the soteriological, the emancipatory implications of meditation as a spiritual practice are found there. It's in self-transcendence that the good stuff of meditation is enjoyed.
Right. So that's that transcendence of identification with those momentary thoughts. They're not even,